Simon, many questions coming in. One of them being, does this not add more weight to the argument that never before now do we need an independent regulator in the game?
It certainly doesn't disarm that argument. I've always felt the independent regulation argument is slightly flawed because the one thing it only needed to really attend to was the distribution of revenue. It really is about the problems in football are predominantly based upon two things: the distribution of revenue with all the money going to the Premier League and very little going anywhere else, and a lack of really enforceable governance. The governance side of things is beginning to be tightened up. The EFL have got proper leadership in place now with Rick Parry and Trevor Birch. The Premier League are being made to be much more accountable about the way that they operate. And the distribution mechanisms are the thing that needed to be focused on. Now, as far as governance is concerned, the Premier League are being forced, and it's really the Premier League that we're talking about, but it should involve all football. The Premier League is being forced to be much more transparent. There was big arguments. Remember when Newcastle were trying to be taken over, and there was an argument about the arbitration hearings and the need for there to be transparency because it's a public domain business.
Yeah.
And I think that's right too. I think certain things need to be kept commercially sensitive, but in real terms, people do need to understand that these public domain businesses are being handled properly and there isn't any bias or agenda that's prohibiting ownerships and acquiring models. If you put independent regulation in, then you're as good as the independent regulator that you get. So I don't like independent regulation because I think it's the wrong thing for football.
It up, Simon.
Well, I don't think it does. I think ultimately
it's another set of eyes on it.
I think most sensible people look at independent regulators and know that most industries have looked at regulators and found them to be stifling of business, stifling of entrepreneurial spirit, and very difficult to work within the confines of very bureaucratic and often not effective in what they do.
No, but it would bring a tighter vetting process.
And the threat of independent regulation is the thing that I like, because it will then make the business of football clean its act up. Because really and truly, if you ask it, despite the fact you look further down the pyramid, you'll hear people saying independent regulation is going to be useful. The big end of the pyramid doesn't want independent regulation because they know what it looks like. Independent regulation will suddenly go, hang on a second, this isn't right. This distribution model of finances is simply not equitable. It wasn't what was agreed 30 years ago. It's what's manifested itself, and we're going to go in there and we're going to unwind all the broadcasting deals. And then Sky are going to turn around and say, well, hang on a second, we're not going to pay money for things that we're subsequently not getting anymore. The Premier League is diminishing because the Premier League is having to redistribute its money into other parts of football in such a way that it's now diminishing the products. And all of a sudden, we don't have quite the standard that we once had before. Right. So independent regulation is a £10 mallet, really, to crush an acorn that should be easily achievable within football if there is leverage. And there's never been leverage before. Now, Gary Neville and his cohorts have created momentum around the idea that is a real legitimacy, and the fan-led review, of course, and the ESL have all led to an energy around independent regulation being part and parcel of a discussion that could really come to the fore, which will then perhaps bring the Premier League to the table and say, okay, better distribution underpinned by better governance. Yeah. And of course you've got to have proper ownership requirements. The reasons why Newcastle weren't able to be taken over, and there's nothing to do with the nonsense that people were alluding to about the Saudi state and the state ownership of a football club, because otherwise you wouldn't have had Man City owned as they currently are. That would have been stopped some time ago. It was all about piracy and the indication of piracy breaching the covenants of the Premier League governance.
Yeah, but you've got to stop the Wild West, haven't you? And that's what it was. And to some extent still is.
Well, I'm not so sure it is the Wild West, but we have
need
to
a reset.
We need a reset on the situation. Don't forget, this is an exceptional circumstances. How many times have we seen situations like this in the world? And of course, I again contradict myself because I made an argument about other ownership models that currently are in vogue in terms of criticism, because we could lay significant criticism at the door of the Chinese government and their policies, and subsequently people that own our football clubs in this country that have associations with the Chinese government.
Chinese owned clubs.
And we could lay the same situation at the Middle Eastern ownership of Man City and of Newcastle United. And some people were saying, hang on a second, why are Chelsea being sanctioned and these clubs' owners aren't being sanctioned? Because quite fundamentally, there's some similarities to what's going on in other parts of the world that aren't occupying our attention. The difficulty is what do you do when the genie's out of the bottle? The commercial values of football clubs have already been established, and there are certain amounts of people around the world that want to operate with a level of wealth that want to buy our football clubs. Yeah. So with the best intent, with the best laid plans of mice and men, no one has really objected to Roman Abramovich's ownership besides the financial ramifications of what he's done, which is splatter cash around everywhere and ultimately drive up the price of football for everybody. But no one objected to it really on a geopolitical level, did they? But now they do, because of what he's brought Chelsea to some extent by his association with Putin into disrepute. So of course there's an argument that the Premier League should want to tighten up its ownership controls, but I don't think that's an independent regulator function. I think that's football taking care of it, and I don't want football to mark its own homework, because these clowns inside football are so arrogant and egotistical that they don't believe that they're accountable for the real world scenarios that we're now being exhibited. We have to be accountable for.
In a sentence, as we head to this break, quite a number of Chelsea fans are saying, do you think our club sponsors are going to cut and run?
No. I think some of them will. But I think that some of them might take a sabbatical and take a pause for a breath, because they don't want to see their imagery splashed all over the back pages of newspapers under very disparaging headlines.
Sure.
And they will also, if they are able to, if some of them might not be able to, because the conditionality of their contract might not allow them to just subsequently get out of the agreement. But I think what you'll see is a few of them doing what a lot of people are doing at this moment in time, which is pulling back, being more focused on their own brand and saying, OK, for the time being, we don't want to be involved in something. McDonald's are going to open again in Russia. They're not going to be closed forever and ever and a day.
No, not for all time, that's for sure. But for the moment, this is seismic, because Abramovich, all of his UK assets have been frozen, and that includes Chelsea.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.